this sounds ridiculous, but maybe just delete that.
Oh,
And then just like reload it.
Event is streaming. We hit record.
Yeah, no, I mean,
And
Fire, like, this is start fresh.
Okay.
Start fresh and reload it. And then you'll get the updated version that doesn't have the dots.
That's why I didn't start till today.
It doesn't have the what?
Just the circles.
I guess I don't really know what that is because I'm not that far yet.
Okay. Well, we'll find a circle.
Jen, you want to pull up the homework 3 solution for me?
Okay.
Well, I mean, you can pull up your fancy slide first if you want, but.
I'm gonna do it.
All right.
So we're going over homework 4, but before we're gonna do this, go over the solution to homework 3.
Okay. So for this, we should start with the changes in. Yeah, we'll let you navigate to it first. Nope, one more down. Next one, there we go. Click solution. Oh, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, we can do it from here.
Solutions, homework 3.
Start with the homework3.html. And let's up the font size on that a little bit for us so that we can actually have a hope and a prayer of seeing it at home. Actually, we're going to release it, so it really doesn't matter. Anybody watching along on the live stream and can't see crap on the projector, well, it'll be on Slack later. Cool. That's still probably way too small for anybody in this room to read it.
Do you guys see it? Here, I'll
I can see it.
We good? We good? Let's
That's
try it.
probably okay. Yeah? Okay. Ooh, yeah, that helped. Did your computer just like, is that a, do you literally have a blue screen of death right now? Jen has a blue screen of death!
I'm like, oh, cool, bring it.
Little frowny face.
Catch fire, yeah. If it did, I wouldn't be surprised. It's like 35% complete.
Okay.
45.
If this is gonna take more than like another like minute, then we can just pull it up on my, maybe
Okay.
you should just start pulling
Yeah,
it up on
start
my
pulling it up.
laptop so that we have it there as a backup.
Also, like the lab. Wait, that's good.
Yeah, not your password.
Also, as a warning, homework 4 is brand new, so there's a lot of bugs in it. So just, I'm gonna say sorry ahead of time. Just bear with me. I'm trying to fix it as people find problems. So every time we find any like bug or something that's not clear, we'll like make that known.
This is my excuse for not starting until today.
Yeah.
Cool.
Wisdom.
That's good.
I'm just waiting. I'm letting everybody else be the guinea pigs, and then I'll go through when it's at its final state.
Also, if you have any like questions too, a lot of things are, as I was like writing out the instructions, some things were not clear, as we found out today with Index Up. So this is my desktop. And, yeah, I don't know what happened, but how about that? Okay, back to Visual Studio Code.
It's cool, somebody's gonna watch like 15 minutes of like nothing on the screen, like waiting for us to get our shit together. It's gonna be great for anybody who didn't attend this live.
Is it recorded? Is it like stored somewhere as well? Or just
Yeah, so it's all on the U's got a channel that stores all of the lectures, everything. There should be a link on the course webpage to both the live stream current event and the kind of history of live streamed events recorded on YouTube.
Work out.
Okay, so we're in the beginning of the homework 3 solution. You can scroll down past the style elements. They don't need to really do anything with that. Okay, first thing here is to actually get your data to update. So this is a little bit further in the solution, but we're just going to go by where it is here. This onload body is going to call the change data command right at the beginning of your page loading. This means that everything will scale properly, everything will get reassigned properly, etc. to your data, which is important because we told you to say only add the click events and mouse over events on update, right? So we had you add that in the on update portion of your JavaScript. Well, unless you call change data to begin with, if you just load up the screen as is until you've made a change or interacted with the system, none of that changes, and so none of it has any of the click functionality. So this body onload command is how we were doing that. There are a couple other ways you could have triggered that, but this is probably the simplest and most straightforward, and is probably good practice for you in terms of if you're creating a system, having kind of the initial page load call the first update with no data changes, just makes sure that everything is working properly. Okay, then we had your details, and then we were linking up. You were required to, hold on, before we get here, technically scroll up to the bottom of the header. These 2 lines, you are required to import D3, which you should be doing using the d3js.org versions. Technically, I saw a couple of people download the actual D3 files and include them in their uploaded home directory. It does work, you can do that. However, it's hosted somewhere that everybody links to already, and that server is not going to go down, so this is probably the simplest and easiest way to get things going. And then linking the script.js file that we gave you to fill out similarly is right up there. Okay, so in the on-click staircase here, this is linking up the staircase button to call the staircase function from our script, and then similarly change data on kind of the data set drop-down selector, and finally, one more down, Jen. Again, change data on click. I had a couple of people that put the random subset function in there. If you'd read and looked at the random subset function returns a random subset of the data, which this checkbox has no idea what to do with that. Instead, and I'm pretty sure this was in the markdown directions, the point was you should be calling change data, and this change data function, which was given to you, looks at the value of this checkbox and calls update data with the correct data or subset of the data accordingly. So if you set the wrong function there, that is probably why your code did not work for that section. The rest of this is given, and hopefully you didn't mess with it. I mean, you could have if you really wanted to, but the update function is going to overwrite most of this anyway. Yes, question?
Is it preferable to do it in the HTML versus doing like a document get element by ID and doing an on-click in the JavaScript? So like with the one you just, the on-click event, if you put that in your JavaScript and do a get element by ID, the ID, and then do an on-click on that element in the JavaScript itself, it gives the same functionality. So sure
it does, provided that your script is running the update to that automatically. And so, for example, the script.js we gave you, it depends on where in the script.js you put that, right? So if you would put that in your update function, then depending on when it gets called in that update function, you have to worry about order in terms of when it loads and things like this. No, there's no real strong preference for putting it in one versus the other, but it really comes down to making sure that you are aware of where that set happens and that you're not calling it before you've actually set it by accident. at least by setting it in the HTML, you know that it's getting loaded and that link is happening through the HTML time period. And in this case, that all works because we have our script load in our header. So we know that in our header, script.js.called, and all of the functions that we defined there are available in the DOM for us to use as we're working through here. If you did it the other way, you might have to have the script at the very end, because otherwise the HTML isn't there for the script to actually be able to get it, right? And so the order of operations is going to matter in that case. And that's really the one thing you need to be aware of. Does that make sense? Cool. Okay, so I think the rest of homework 3 HTML we don't care about, and we can look at script.js now, which is going to be the core things that you needed to implement. So first we've got the staircase function, which was for part 2. The solution for this looks like get element by ID for the bar chart, grab its children, and then we're simply using a for loop to iterate over those elements, which are all rect bars, and set an attribute of them based on some linear scale factor of the index here to create a staircase. If you did something more complex, like sorting the bars based on their length, A-OK, that's totally fine. What we were looking for was that you knew how to select elements and update their attributes accordingly using the DOM API. So as long as you showed us that you could do that and the end result looked quasi like a staircase, we gave you credit. The update command, or update function, is next. We gave you some base code here, so if you, Jen, scroll for me a little bit. Here we go. So we gave you these next 2 sections, which were converting strings to numbers from the CSV import. At the very bottom, there's a function that the change data function that will grab the CSV files, import them. You're free to look at that for your own edification, but we kind of gave it to you, so I'm not going to cover exactly what it was doing. This is required because of that, is really what that's there for. The scales were also something we gave you because we wanted to ensure that everybody had a consistent and D3-based way of mapping from data values to pixel values. So the point was for your A attributes of your data, your B attributes of your data, and your indexes I, you should have been using these scale factors that we gave you. If you didn't, depending on how you didn't, we may have taken off some partial points. Sometimes we gave warnings. I don't remember which were for which, but we set them up in the rubric and we were consistent once we did it. So, use of scales. Parts 3 and 4 integrated here together are updating the bar chart. So starting with, again, using the D3 selection now for the bar chart element, grabbing the rect elements from that, binding the data to it. We've got our traditional exit, enter, and merge loop here. Note that we're exiting all old elements, and we're actually doing the enter with those attributes updated on enter in combination with the merge here. So the enter and the merge, we haven't quite separated, mostly because you could take this and do a let entering selection equal and then do an append with the merge, but because what's important is that we have a way of ensuring that we can update the attributes, simply appending them as part of the merge command here works just fine for those purposes. We have then the attributes that we're setting for both the updating and the entering elements. So this is with Y, and then our mouse over, mouse out elements on. So this is the part 4 portion of interactivity. As you note here, we're using A scale because we're in the A bar chart, I scale for the Y value, which is the based on the index for these bars, and as discussed in the homework, for handling mouse over events, the correct function is this d3.on command. And that on command takes various DOM events, such as mouse over or mouse out, and you can then do specific things like setting the fill attributes of those to something and then setting it back to what it was originally on mouse out. Most people did not appear to have problems with this, so I'm kind of glossing over it a little bit. If you have specific questions, though, feel free to raise your hands. Yeah.
What is that G? D-I-G?
Yes, okay, so DIG. In D3 with selections, when you have data bound, you can basically, every time, in the same way that you would have the D function, this function actually has up to 3 different arguments. The first one is the actual data, bound data value, that's D. I is the index in the array of the bound objects. And G is this array of actual objects, right? So in this case, what we have is an array of rectangles, right, that we selected. And so when we, after the data bind, when we're looking at this, if we wanted to do, in case of Y here, we use D and I because we wanted to use the index. You could also make this into DIG, this into DIG, and G simply provides an array of the actual DOM objects for you.
So it
right?
actually parse the data object.
So this is an array of recs, actual recs, not a D3 selection. This is the actual distinct rectangles from the SVG in your DOM. Okay? So what this is doing then is we are reselecting using D3 the specific element, the specific rectangle at index I, which is now giving us a D3 selection that contains just that one rectangle. And given that D3 selection, we can now use the D3.attribute command to update it. Alternatively, you could have done gi.setAttribute with the DOM setAttribute command, like we did up in the staircase function, and that would have worked just as well. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. All right, so the B bars is pretty much the exact same thing, except, and you didn't update your solution recently, did you? Yeah, so in the actual solution that's going to get released, note that, and this is, so, yeah, no, keeps, right, no, up, sorry. B bars right here, that's wrong. So if you did that, and the actual solution that's going to be released and that we graded you on is updated accordingly, but note here, this is using A scale for the B data. That is something we took off points for. So yes, very easy mistakes to make. The version that will go out on Slack later tonight will have the correct things in it, but just pointing that out to you how simple that is of a mistake to make. So we've got the line generators, then our we gave you the A line generator. We talked in the last homework lab about how those were supposed to be used. So A line generator, B line generator, we were doing a selection with line generator function wrapping the data as the attribute update for the specific path attribute portion of those selections, and everything works fine. Exact same thing for the area generators if we continue to scroll down. The same basic thing, the only difference is that the area data generator has some additional content to it. For the purposes of the assignment, you should have basically been copying the one from A to B and changing A scale to B scale. That was all you needed to do for these. And then finally the scatter plot, in which you are kind of running the exact same enter, update, merge selection because data elements are going to get added and removed here. So D3 select scatter plot, we're selecting all the circles and binding the data to them, doing an exit remove, doing our enter and merge here of appending new circles with a given radius, taking all of those points and updating the CX, CY values according to the scales. And then the final part here was ensuring that the data point was clicked or printed to the console when clicked. And we took either the kind of actual data values or the scaled data values by A and B. Yeah.
Sorry, this is a question back on the on-click stuff. So in the assignment description, it said use JavaScript for your on-click events, not to use D3.
So this was something that so there was an announcement that went out.
Oh, okay.
We were, as TAs, got confused about this point. You were supposed to use JavaScript, but technically we are going to allow either vanilla JavaScript or D3 is still JavaScript. The point of that particular portion in the assignment, which I did not know when we were originally talking through this stuff, is you should not be using CSS hover selectors. So
Okay.
technically, those bar chart interactions,
D3 is fine. 'Cause I was trying to
D3 is fine. If you had done it with SVG, that is also fine, and we gave you full credit for it.
I was trying to do it with JavaScript after I realized I did it with D3. Like, oh, I have to change it now, and then I couldn't figure it out. And then like, oh, I'll send it.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it wound up being we accepted both and either, and for any of the kind of confusion that we may have caused with people trying to re-implement portions of their solution they didn't need to, we are very sorry. That's on us. So the only other things that we didn't talk about here are the extra credit of, the rest of the code they were provided, of adding transforms and of the tooltip. And we're going to briefly cover the transforms and the tooltip together by talking through what can only be described as an epidemic of very few people got credit for a tooltip. Because almost everybody made the exact same mistake with regard to setting their tooltip. And we are going to start with, provided the internet works, technical difficulties. We are going to start with pulling up a simplified version of just the scatterplot code with something that looks very similar to what everybody did. And I'm going to ask you guys to explain to me why this is very, very wrong. Because this is, you don't want CSS. We don't care about the CSS. Switch it over to the JavaScript. Okay. So move the scatter plot down to begin with. And we'll just go through the code first and see if anybody can pick up on it, and then we'll illustrate what's happening with the scatter plot, and then we'll go back to how to fix it. So starting with the HTML, this is what you were given before, pretty much exactly. You've got your kind of scatter plot ID with some initial circles, and we're calling the change data function on load here so that things automatically get updated to begin with. And so our change data is going to call update with the data. There technically is a drop down in there where you can just select the different data sets. We didn't do the random subset for this because it doesn't matter. So this is exactly the same code we walked through all the way to, keep going, scatter plots, enter, exit. Don't give me a little bit up further because I want to go through the transitions. So after the merge command, rather than just updating attributes CX and CY here, adding dot transition with a duration automatically does a nice smooth transition. So now if you pull up the scatter plots and change the data set for me. Right? Beautiful transitions. Most people got their transitions. So very, very small update to get extra credit working there. Now back to the JavaScript. This is your on-click command for your scatter plot points. And this is the very wrong solution that most people gave for how to provide a mouse over using the SVG title element. Why is this wrong? Hand over in the corner.
Because every time you mouse over, it makes a new title.
Yeah, every time you mouse over, it makes a new title. And so what is the end result of that? A bunch of titles where we've moused over here. Now, Jen, minimize the code for a second. Bring the scatter plot all the way up so we can see it. We just did this top right corner here, and it was like 19 something, right? Now change the data set to anything else, and let's watch where that one goes. Use 2, because I know where it goes on 2. All right, so it went to the exact bottom corner. So the actual value here is like 4 something, and our tooltip still says 19. That's very wrong. So if your code did this, you did not get credit for the tooltip because it's not updating correctly. And if we look at the actual SVG, which we can do by doing d3.select with our scatterplot ID, and look at the, nope, you need the dot node.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Cool, we can see exactly what's going on here. Scroll, yep, this line right here. We had a whole bunch of different title commands of the 19 from when we were messing around showing you that exact same stuff. When we came down to the bottom, it appends another title, but it's only ever going to show you the very first one. So what is the correct solution? Bueller?
You need to do a dot exit.
Dot exit would not help. I mean, yeah, not in this case. There are a couple of different solutions. Well, I missed.
Mouse over.
So mouse out is one potential solution. You could basically on mouse out select the title element that's there and remove that title element so that every single time you're appending a title element and then removing the title element. What's another solution though that doesn't require you to append and remove title elements repeatedly? No, so the title element only displays whatever text is set between it, right? So in theory, and in practice actually, so which is what we do here, you can create a title element, append it to the SVG, and simply update the text value on mouse over. Right? That'll mean that the tooltip is consistently there, but anytime you mouse over it, it updates to what it should be now, and that's what gets displayed. Does that make sense? So we actually implemented this for you. What we did is we created a wrapper function that rather than just calling change data, goes through, grabs all the scatter plot points and appends a title to them, and then calls change data. You could also go over here and add a a title element manually to the SVG code, but that's a pain in the butt to do by comparison. And now, to change the wrong solution to the correct solution, Jen, scroll, did you change? Yeah, you're just changing, that was what? Append, and now it's select. So now you're going through and you're selecting that same title element, and now if we do a tooltip on this guy and we update it. So he should be that guy there.
Slightly different. But let's check.
And yeah, you can check using the console log command we did before. Can you just hit up? Does it? Nope. Okay. Figured I'd check. .node. And we've got the single title element that on mouse over, we're just updating the text entry for. Okay? So again, we are going over this in detail because having that append in there suggests to us that the vast majority of people still do not fully have this whole enter update loop thing down. Because if you did, you would recognize that simply appending something within an update loop is going to repeatedly append it every single time rather than reuse things, which ends in very bad code behaviors for you. We clear? All right. So with that, Jen is now going to walk through some of the trouble spots in homework 4.
Question.
Yes.
So when we're doing the pen and all of this stuff we've been doing, I don't see a for loop there. You call it a loop. Where's the loop?
The loop, when I said loop there that I'm talking about, is the fact that we are doing all of that within the context of a function update that is going to get called repeatedly, right? And the fact that that function, that this block of code that we're discussing is going to get called repeatedly means that you have to recognize and have done the proper things of which ones are being updated, which ones are outgoing, which are incoming, and handled that all correctly so that when this single block of code gets called repeatedly, everything works as you expect it to rather than simply spinning off out of control, which is pretty much what we were seeing, right? Does that make sense? So loop may have been a little bit of a not as good descriptor as I could have said, but
Repetitive function calls. Anyway, so I guess I wanted to start by just asking everyone how homework 4 was going if you guys started.
how many people started homework 4? And how many people similar go, it's not going great right now? Yeah? Yeah, all right, good.
Cool. Okay, so
Well, I mean, not
Not
good,
good.
but
good that you're here because we're going to walk through some stuff. So I noticed that there's a couple things that are a little unclear and also things that are kind of a, I'm trying to think of the right word, a problem spot for people getting started with the homework. Specifically, how do we add a region to our map data? And what is the country data class and how do we use it? So you guys were all at lecture, yes? Last Tuesday. So I thought that the whole process of generating a geopath is going to be harder than it is. But the real problem is organizing the data, basically reformatting the data to an array of country data objects. So for those of you that have started, that I was helping during office hours, does the country data object make sense now? Okay, cool. So basically in JavaScript, the class, especially this like country data class, so can you guys all go to your map.js? So at the very top, you're going to find a class that's called country data. And that's going to be, in JavaScript, the classes are just fancy objects, basically. So we're going to go to, yeah, that'll be sick. We're going to go and we're just going to walk through what I'm talking about here.
we don't want to open solutions. No.
Just moved it. Just moved this folder. It's now nested.
Hub, homework, or this is the correct measure.
But I think you'd expect it.
Homework 4. Data. Okay. Okay, so we're going to.
So we're in drama. So if we just scroll to the top.
There we go.
So there we go. This is what I'm talking about. So we have a country data class. What is that? So basically, we're being passed. So when you go in your script, one of the first instructions is is you're going to need to call the draw map function when you're going to pass the data to it, right? So we're going to do that. We already have our world map object.
Dance.
Data. Way off. Okay. Data. So we have this topo JSON data. We're passing that as a parameter to a draw map. So we should be able to go into draw map. We're going to console.log that just to make sure. What is the parameter? World. So now our data is called world. And from what you guys remember in lecture, it's topo JSON data, right? So we're going to go, have to start the actual server, go in live, and we're going to be able to see it in the console. Probably old news to people in office hours just a little bit ago, but here it is. Okay. So what we really want to look at, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to convert it to what? GeoJSON. So, just to make it clear, we're going to call it GeoJSON. And then, how do we do that? Topo JSON.feature. We have our world data we specify, and then I believe it's world.objects. Dot. Okay. So then we're going to look at what it looks like now as GeoJSON. So now we have GeoJSON data. We're getting a little closer here. So, oh look, we have a feature collection. We go in, we have features, and it's an array of countries. So basically we have an array of objects here. But you'll notice we have the country ID, right? We have the type, the feature, we have the properties, and we have the geometry, but we don't have a region. And we need that, we're going to class it. So, what we want to do is just to like really hit home that we're looking at features as an array. There's our array. This is what we want to work with. You're going to notice at the top of your map.js, you have population data, which is all of our data, just the first object in our data, or it's kind of key, all of our population data. And our name array, which we're going to look at right now, is, you see, who is familiar with map? Anyone? You are? Okay. So can you tell us what we're doing here? So we have our population data, we're mapping it. Looks like we're grabbing .geo.
Yeah, so what you're doing is you're taking the population data that you have there, and you're taking each individual element and like mapping it to another type of thing. In this case, it looks like you're taking the geo in that element, putting it to uppercase, and that returns an array, which is put into name array.
Yeah, so another way of describing that is map is a for each loop that takes the return value of whatever your function is and puts that return value in an array corresponding to the input array that you are calling the for each loop on.
Does that make sense, everyone?
That's a lot better explanation. I just like to think of it as like a function.
It is a function mapping,
It's
right?
mapping
You
from
can,
input to an output.
so if it's easier to think as a function mapping, but if you're not like code savvy, and we've talked about kind of for loops here, map is really just a special type of for loop that is using return values and giving you an array of the return values for an array of inputs, which from a computer science perspective is exactly a function mapping, right? These are basically one and the same.
And if you don't feel quite comfortable with maps, then you can still use for each. It's
Right,
just
you would need to create an array and then do like the for each and append it to the array And you can do that, but map just does that for you without you having to create an array object and then push things into the array.
So, what
Yes,
do we got?
question.
Does it change the original array?
No, it makes a new one.
Which is another cool thing for map. So we have 197 objects in our population data array. So we have more countries in our map data than we do in our population data, but that's okay. We're going to deal with that later. But I want you to look at the population data. So we're going to go into one of these, whatever the first country is. We're going to scroll down, and you're going to see, oh man, we have region, Asia, boom, for Afghanistan. Okay, and what is this geo? Oh, it looks like that's the ID. So we're going to go down. We're going to go down to this array. So basically what we did is we made an array, a separate array from the population data that is the same length that just has these IDs. And I made them to all caps so they would match our map data. So let's take a look. Boom. Okay. So now we have an ID for our map data. We have an array of
IDs.
IDs. So what we gotta do is we're gonna loop through. Does anyone know or remember what index of is? Index of. It's a
Yes,
lot.
there's a hand raised over there.
So, index of, we want to check to see, where did I jump to? Okay, so we want to check to see, basically we want to loop through because we have more countries in our map than our population data array. We want to loop through each country object that we have, and we want to check to see if the country ID is in our name array. So, we're going to start with the name array, but it's important to remember that our population data and our name array, same length, each ID is in the same position in both objects. So a specific ID for a country in the name array is going to be the same ID in the population data. Does that make sense to everyone right now? We're going to see it in action. So we want to loop through our country data, right? So geo, JSON. We could go for each, but we're going to switch it up when we didn't do enough hours and use map. So JSON dot dot map. So we want to basically we're going to loop through each object in our features array. We're going to call them country. And let's go. Let's first, just to be all on the same page, we want to get that ID parameter, right? So we're just going to console that really quick, just so you guys know what that looks like. Does it have an ID? What is it?
Did you show the one line code that you added in script.js before you came over to map.js?
Yeah, totally. So what I basically did, the first thing, so I'm basically just calling this drawback function and passing it the map data. So it's weird, it's like we're working with objects. So we created a new little map object that has all of its functions in it. That's how we're accessing. This is our we created the map, and in the map we have a map. Okay.
So add the return null to that just for the reference. You are doing a map function, right? So it is going to return an array of something. Make sure you're returning an array of something. Just for your own edification, if we're using a map function rather than a for each function, that return value is going to be important.
So we're going to console the country IDs. Boom. next step. What was that thing? Index of. So we're going to go through. We're going to check if this dot name array dot index of, what are we checking? Country ID. So basically we're asking, okay, so if this name array has the country ID in its index, it's going to give us the index. If it doesn't, it's going to return -1. So
you could actually console log that.
yeah, I was going to do is greater than -1.
Yep, there you go.
Console. Here, I'm actually just going to do this.
There could also be different than -1.
Yes. So if
So somebody hit the lights from here real quick. I mean, we're just going to do this real quickly on the board to explain exactly what's going on with index of. Yeah, question.
Where did you get the name array?
so the name array is already set up for you. It's at the very top, just above population data. In the constructor. Yeah.
So we're going to assume this is an array of objects where these objects all have some ID that is a 3-letter something. Right, so it's going to be something like this, and then we'll have another object. What was the ID that we had in there? A USA. We had one for Afghanistan, which was like AFG, right? Okay. So assume we have an array of, and let's just make it this specific array. Right? Okay. So this is our array. Let A is equal to this. Index of A dot index of. We'll look for specifically a element corresponding to whatever you're passing in here. So in our case, we're actually doing something slightly more. We have a name array, which rather than IDs of these things, literally is just the array of XXX, USA, AFG, right, as strings. This is what we're dealing with. An index of, if we do XXX, is going to return 0. If we call this with AFG, who can tell me what it's going to return? 2. And if we call this with HAY, what's it going to return? -1, right. So if it's searching for this thing, this match, and that match doesn't exist, it returns -1. Any other time it's going to return whatever the index of the object that is the match, right? So you can get any values that are between -1 and 1 minus the length of this array are valid return values. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool.
Okay, which brings us to this. So we're looping through each country. We're looking at the country ID. We're checking to see if this name array has the country ID in it. If it does, this index is going to be greater than -1. We're going to console.log that country ID. Else, we're going to console.log not found. We're just going to do this just to check. Cool. So we're finding them. We're all on the same page here. You're good? Okay. So what we're going to do, so we found it, right? Or some of them. So if it's there, we're going to look at, we're not going to do the country ID. We're going to do something a little crazy. And we're going to console.log. So the index in the name array is going to be the same as the index in the population data, right? So let's check it. Population data. We're going to get at that index, right? And we're going to console.log country ID too. We just want to see if it matches. So let's check it. Boom. Do they match? Looks like it. So now we know that we're matching it. So what does the population data have that our countries don't have? A region. So where this comes into play, and this is where things get a little weird, is the country data class, which is our fancy object. We want to make an array of them. So what does it take? These parameters to create it. So what do we want to return?
Oh wait, I want them to actually answer. What are we, if we want an array of map objects and we were calling a map command, what are we returning?
The map.
A map object. So this needs to be a new map object, right?
Okay. Does that make sense? Kind of have to restructure some things. It's a little weird. So let's say we found it, right? So I just created a variable just to make it a little easier called region. And this happens each time we go to a new country. So this is happening for each country. So region, we're gonna set to what?
The population. The dot.
Population data.
Oh no, the index.
Have that index. And then what did it have? Boom. And so if it doesn't, what I told them, it's kind of a tricky little trick. There's a class called countries, which is the default color class for our countries. So if we don't have it, let's just call it countries and see what happens. Okay, so we have this region variable. If the index is greater than 1, if we have a match, we're going to have region, actually. Okay. So country data. So we're going to make sure that we're passing all of the parameters that we need to our country data. Everything, so we have type is on our country, right? As we were looping through them. Our ID is also on our country. Everything is going to be on our country except for the region.
Which we just set.
Which we just set. So, okay, so going through everything. So we're mapping, or actually, we actually have to set a variable. We're returning it. Okay, so we have our country data. We're mapping the GeoJSON features from that array. We're finding the region. If we can't find it in the name array, it doesn't have a region. We're saying console logging not found, and then region is just going to be countries. So let's check and see if we did this right.
So why did we take out in the else the region assignment?
So, right.
We're saying it to country as a default? But we
Yeah.
actually-
Yeah. So rather than what it was before was
Oh,
let
it's saying
region
default.
equal nothing, and then on else we're setting it to this thing. Well, you could also just initialize it to that thing, and only set it in the case that we actually have an index of something else to set it to.
Yes.
Yeah, I just removed it. I just saw it taken away.
Oh, yeah.
You don't change it back to countries on each loop once it defaults to the previous thing
Nope.
you set it to?
No, because this let is happening inside the function, right? Recall that this arrow notation is literally defining an implicit function. So anything in these brackets is in function scope. And in JavaScript, variables don't leave function scope. unless you define them as var, which you shouldn't be doing because that allows you to screw lots of things up. But that's old JavaScript, don't do that.
So, suspense. What are we going to get? An array of country data objects. Should we check and see if we did this right? Boom! Do we have the regions? Yes. If it doesn't have a region, is it called countries? Yes. Can we do this another way? Probably. But is this easier? So, let's see here.
So if, for example, we didn't want to return entries for which we don't have regions, what would we do? So, yeah, I think that would actually work. I was like, you could do something more complex with, but no, that would work. For anything else, it's going to return nothing. So
You want to return them though, otherwise Greenland won't show up. You want to do that.
okay,
Yeah. So return all of them. But if you didn't want to, you can check and see if this works.
oh, that's only going to return them if they don't exist.
Demo. 57 not found. We have a bunch of undefined in our.
Right. And now you could also imagine doing some additional filtering on the data that you're passing in to double check for some of these things ahead of time and stuff like that as in a way of narrowing down data and doing manipulation if you want to. The point was more just so you're aware of exactly what you're doing and what the differences are here. And if you wanted to and needed to go digging further in deeper, now you have at least some tools, hopefully, for starting to let you work in that space. Does that make sense?
So, this is going to be your data. This is going to be your data. Anyway, for the sake of moving on to other important things that we need to address, does that make sense to everyone? Yes. Okay, moving on to the next problem. Present mode. Okay, so another weird thing, we have draw a plot. Some of you might not have gotten there yet. We're drawing just groups and classing them x-axis, but we're not doing anything to them. If you read the instructions right, why are we doing that? It doesn't seem to make much sense. So we have a code pen for that. So, okay, simple version, explanation. And I was trying to explain this earlier, and it was hard to just do it without having a little demo here. So basically, we have draw plot, right? This is like this part two. So some of you might not have gotten here yet, but this is the same idea as far as the tooltip. So we have draw plot that we call once, right? And we have update plot, which we call like so many times. We're gonna do it like 100 times. So you don't want to. What would happen if you put append x-axis in your update plot? You're going to be getting so many x-axis. So you want to just do it once. So you're creating this group. Let's see where I put it.
In this case, you can think about draw plot as initialize plot, right? What you're doing is you're setting up the structures that you are going to reuse in update plot.
Like you don't have to keep drawing.
Exactly.
So we have draw plot, which is very eerily similar to our homework. We have our data, which is not similar at all, but it's going to work. And then we have update plot, which is kind of similar to what we have in our homework. So, what did I do at the bottom? I drew the plot. Boom. Okay. So, there's an imaginary group there. We're going to update.
I mean, it's not just imaginary. We created something, right? We should be able to console log and see that there is something there, right? So what does drop block create? Let's look at it. That, okay, yeah?
Go into a wrapper group. We have this class there. It's there. You just can't see it yet.
It's not imaginary. It is very much there. It is just invisible.
You can have a text label. Okay. So what are we gonna do with it? We're gonna update. I can move this out. Okay. So update block. What happens when we use data 1? And our label is gonna be data 1. Boom. That was fast. Okay. So now we have an axis.
What does data 1 look like so that they've got the comparison?
Yeah. Okay. So basically,
Data 1 goes from 2 to 8.
2 to 8.
And we're creating our axis such that, let's look at update plot.
Let's look at it.
Update plot grabs the maximum of our data values and uses a linear scale from 0 to the max value based on the width of the element that we have, right? So we're taking the element that we have and we're scaling the axis to be the max width of that based on these data values 0 to 8. Yes, question?
I know you're using D3.max there.
Yeah.
Other math.max doesn't seem to like it. Because
So-
I guess there's a lot of country objects.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, math.max expects not an array. Math.max expects a list of actual things like this. So if you have an array, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you pass this into math.max of A, it is not going to work. It's just going to be like, nope, I don't know what you want me to do. How do you take A and do that? You have to use, and this was covered briefly in lecture, there is this ... syntax, which takes an array and breaks it out into a list like this. So if you did math.max of ... A, it's going to be exactly what you want. So as long as you know that special trick, then you can get it to work using math.max. But you've also got D3.max, which is going to take the array for you just by default. So whichever of those solutions you want to use, you can use. Up to you. But that is why math.max is not working the way you're expecting it to. Okay?
So
Can you just go back up in the initial one you call, we're just creating what, a group?
just a group. Yeah.
Just a group with a class?
So the SVG, you create a group. We're just classing. We're classing an x-axis just so we know how to select a layer. So if we were to take this, if we were to just say, let's comment. Is this comment out there? Okay. So if we just take.
I see a bunch of you recording this. These code pens are available in the slides that we are going to post.
Yeah, 12.
So you can totally go back and grab the content. And there's also a video here of potentially our talk over of this. Feel free to record if you want to, need to, for your own edification. However, these resources will be available. And if they're not, you ping the Slack channel and be like, guys, you said you were going to upload the resources. And we go, we're sorry. Yeah, so.
So I'm basically going to show you what happens. So we can't set up our scale in draw plot because we don't know the scales. We don't have the data.
You need to look at the HTML model CSS, right?
Okay. So now we're gonna, every time we update, we're appending a group, right? So if we put that here, what happens? Row, into. Okay. So it doesn't like something. It's just selecting wrong. Something else is broken. So it is broken. I need a minute to figure out why it's broken. But what happens if we put it here and we just append our group? And then, like, every time we update, we're appending a group. We're going to get a ton of groups, which is why we have it separately.
Of which you will render, the SVG will nicely for you just render the last one on top of everything. But also you're still going to have all of this additional stuff in the back end, which is going to start slowing down your SVG render like crazy.
Your text, if you're like appending text as well. So, does that make sense to everyone? Why we're selecting this imaginary group? Why we can't put our scales in draw plot? We don't have the data yet.
Where is the update, I mean remove and enter remove, is that going on there? Or?
No,
So the enter remove is not going on there, and the reason for that is, again, this is, so in enter remove works when you have data to mine, right? And we talked about how when you don't have data to mine, you could bind arbitrary data, right? And I think we talked about this in the very first homework lab, where you could bind arbitrary data, or you could do something like set a unique ID for that thing and check to make sure that that selection doesn't exist and then create it accordingly, right? So this is basically what's happening here is the equivalent of that select by ID creation. But because we know that it doesn't get created until we call drawPlot, and we only call drawPlot once, well, we don't need to check whether or not the ID exists. We can see our HTML, we know exactly what it is, we know where we're calling drawPlot. It hasn't been created yet. So what we're doing is we're creating it there, we're setting the ID, and now any other time anywhere else in the code, as long as drawPlot isn't going to get called again, you are more than A-OK to just select that ID and update that ID. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you wanted to be really redundant about your code, which is good coding practice, then in drawPlot you should be doing a check before you append the object with that ID to make sure that ID doesn't exist. And you could do the if check looking back at kind of the previous lab stuff of how you would go about doing that. Right?
Yep.
Okay.
For the sake of getting to one, we're going to skip through this one. To get to events, we're going to move forward. But does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, so events. You're going to be using events to change the data or highlight.
Just like you did in homework 3.
Yes. There's very subtle differences in different events that you're going to be using that are going to be important. So, basically, this is like D3 specific. If you feel more comfortable using JavaScript, you can definitely do that. I find D3 events a little more simple.
I'm also going to, I think this is a very important and a great place to talk about this. This looks a little bit different to the event, the way it was set up in homework 3. What is this? Does anybody remember what we set up in homework 3? Somebody asked specifically about what the heck that was. What sort of function implicitly were we setting up in the homework 3 solution? It had data, index, and group, right? So we had an arrow function that looked like this. Right?
Yes.
This is the exact same as if we had done this arrow function.
Yeah, that's
Right? Is what exactly is being set up right here. So this does take a DI and a G. But instead of using what we did before is we used G of I, and we did a D3 select on that to get the selection of the node associated, of this particular element that our data is bound to, right? Technically, this same implicit function format in D3, you can use this in this very specific function context, and this is exactly equal to that D3.select G of I here, right? So here's the thing, because we're not passing in the data, the I, the G, you can still use this without having access to G or I here, and be confident that that is that object. I personally, because this can get really confusing in other contexts, because it depends on scope, the exact function scope, I prefer to do kind of the dig and D3 select G of I, just so I always know exactly what I'm accessing. But what you're seeing here is just that convenience variable way of doing it using this.
What is this? It's representing the D or the G?
This is representing D3 select G of I. It doesn't represent D or G. So technically, when we create in D3, when we have on events, right, we can, that on event triggers a function, and that function has access to D, I, G, and D3.select G of I.
So it's the element. This is talking about the element.
So G of I is the element. This is the D3 selection of that element.
So
right? Remember how we talked about D3 selections actually have dot nodes, which are the actual elements themselves, right? G of I is specifically the DOM element. This is that DOM element in a D3 selection, so that you can then use the D3 commands with it.
So this element specifically is a drop-down menu. So it looks like an X drop-down menu. So when we're saying this, it's the element, the options of that element, the index of that, and then the value of that option in the array. Does that make sense? It's a little abstract.
Can you repeat that?
So,
Where did that come from?
I mean,
That statement.
so that is because he's right. It's probably better to use what he's doing than what I'm using. So I'm using
I
function.
wouldn't even know how to explain what that is because I
Yeah.
don't do it this way.
So I'm not using an arrow function. So this is different. So this dot update. So this dot update is referring. This is technically this dot update, but because this is different, this is referring to the element. If I were to put this dot update, it's going to be like, oh, there's no update associated with this element, so it returns that it's not a function. So outside of this this scope, you can put what I put. A lot of people use self because of Python, apparently. So so you basically create a variable, let that equals this.
Yeah, can I try to explain the way that I think of it?
Yeah.
So she defined a function here, and inside that function, the word this is a pointer to that object. Outside of that function, the word this will point to a different pointer to a different object. So what she did is she defined a variable called that and set that variable to that first pointer outside of that function. And then if she needs to interact with that larger level objects, usually like the class that you're interacting with here, she can use that variable to get to it. She just defined a new pointer variable to the earlier thing, and that this, in this context, is a new pointer to this new.
And this, kids, is why you should name your variables in descriptive ways.
There's no magic with that.
I don't know if that's
You
helpful,
can
but
call
that's
it-
the way that I think about it.
That is, yeah. So that's
Right.
exactly.
Which is why I named it that. I find it close, for me in particular, I find it close enough. People will look at that and be like, that is dumb. I just find that, for me, memorable because it's close to this, but it is not. So,
Can you go back over and answer Brent's question behind what is the element again? That's a drop down menu?
so the element, for this example, I tried to abstract it,
I see.
but it would be whatever element that is,
That you're working on.
yeah, exactly. In this case, it's a drop
But like because it's a drop-down menu, and you know it's a drop-down menu, that drop-down menu has options and selected index. Like
Yeah.
these are attributes of the object that is being passed in, which in this case is a drop-down menu. If it were something else, you would use the attributes of whatever that element object were. Does that make sense?
So the first this before options is the this of the current element,
Yeah.
and then this within the brackets
Is still that this because it's in the same function scope. So this changes based on function scope. So as long as you're in the same function, you know this is the same. But if we did this right here outside, right, it's not in the same function, it's no longer guaranteed to be the same.
I would highly recommend using Sam's way. Like, arrow functions are nice, and like the whole like DIG is a very nice way of handling it.
Yeah.
So you don't have to say
To
that.
me, it makes so much more
Can I
sense.
see how specifically this works? For example, this is a drop-down box, right?
Yes.
And then the options of it, but then again the drop-down box, and then the selected index.
So, right, I'm imagining that your drop-down box, I don't actually know this off the top of my head, but looking at this, I'm expecting that the drop-down box, if we have something that's set, is going to have an array of various options, of which one of them is the current selected option, right? Because every drop-down menu has one of these that's currently selected. So what you've got is this dot options is the array of those various options. Selected index is the index of that array that is the current selected one. So if we want to get the value associated with the particular option in here, which has some value, right, then what we're doing is we're taking the fact that we know we have the index of which one is selected, we're grabbing that from the array, which is returning this particular element, right, the selected option element from this array, and then we're grabbing the value out of that, and that's what X is.
But most of this is done for you. Like, it's like you don't have to worry about the options. So you just gotta call the function. You just gotta pass the data to the function. But for the sake of getting through what I actually wanted to explain,
Woo!
is the nice little word change. Because I noticed in some of the homework when I was grading it that some of you, when you were working on events, there's like weird subtle differences with events, right?
Oh,
So,
yeah, no, this was something I did notice. This is good.
So we're supposed to use change.
Well, you can. You don't have to. But change is a good way. On click. So I noticed that some people in their drop-down menus, they use on click. So when you click on it, you notice a weird jump. And that's because whenever you click it,
It wasn't just a weird jump. It was happening the last thing you set, right? So when you have a drop-down menu, right, on click triggers exactly when you click on it. So when you've clicked on it, what you're getting is the value of the last thing that was previously set. And that's what's being called, right? So on change is going to do it when the value changes. So you're going to get the new value that is set, right? And this creates very, very different user experiences where I was trying to grade something and clicking on like changing the drop box and it didn't change, and then I was like, let me change it back, and then it changed to the original thing, and I'm like, what just happened? Yes.
I made sure to comment that I didn't dock points because I'm like subtle detail, but like I just mentioned in the comments. So I noticed you did on click. That's cool. You know, you did what you gotta do. But on change is a good thing. So you can do that. Or wildcard, which on input, which is a whole other thing. You'll notice that, okay, this is like a really boring description because I just got this from like Mozilla, but immediately after the value of an element has changed, that's when the event is triggered. This one on change occurs when the event loses focus after the content has been changed. I have no idea what they mean.
Oh, so I know exactly what that means. So, yeah, in a drop-down, there's not going to be much difference there because when you click it, the drop-down collapses, right? So those are going to happen almost simultaneously. However, you could be using something like a series of checkboxes or something where a click doesn't lose focus necessarily. You could click multiple things, and then your mouse leaves like this overall multi-select thing. In that case, on change is only going to trigger after you've finished all of your multi-select, whereas on input or whatever it was, will change on every single click because the state is changing within the object.
And it's going to make a big difference in sliders. So we have another code pen just to show you, because that definition
Slider's a great way of explaining that.
Looking at that font, like the definition, I'm like, okay, I kind of see what you're saying, but at the same time, I have no idea what you're talking about. So this is the difference in interaction. So we have, I'm assuming that this is on change because we're not seeing a year. But basically, we have a year slider. This isn't as important. This is also set up for you. But yeah, anyway. So on input, bear with me here. We might have an error. Yes. Okay. So we have our year slider. On change, it's going to change the text. Did you see that? But it's kind of weird because it only changes
Once you leave the dot.
when we move it. Yeah, when we lift up. So on input, we're going to see what happens there. Oh.
But here's the thing. There are certain times where in order to make sure that your code is interactive, doing this on input change, say this is triggering something that's pulling a massive amount of data from 1974 and doing a whole bunch of complex data processing on that, and assume it's going to take like 3 seconds. If you're calling that 3-second thing for every single year between 1940 and 2001 in half a second, your browser's going to choke, right? Like, so in that case, like if you're doing heavy data processing, the on change makes a lot of sense because you can update the slider and your browser doesn't just like freeze on you, and instead will only trigger the 3-second update at the end.
But if, for example, you're making a gap plot, scatter plot, and you want it to change when you're moving the slider back and forth because it looks cool.
And because what you're doing in that case is really updating object positions using D3, which is doing stuff very, very quickly for you as long as you're not using for loops and you're instead using the D3 selectors with like attributes set on that D3 selection object from a data bind standpoint. So provided you're using the proper D3 functionality, you don't have to worry about it choking. Assuming you're trying to redo that all yourself using 4 nested for loops, yeah, it's going to be a problem. But that's why you should be using the D3 syntax.
Does that make sense?
I don't know if this is what you just said, but like you could separate it out, right? To where like maybe the year shows as you slide, but then you can like
on
Absolutely.
on change or whatever on like.
So that would just be setting two different functions here.
Right, and then it would do the data processing, right? So
Yeah,
you-
but in the case of your gap plot, the point Jen was saying is as long as you're implementing the stuff in your gap plot correctly, then the gap plot should be rendering and updating quick enough that you don't have to worry about waiting to do the data processing until afterward. It should work seamlessly for you.
Should we do a demo before, I mean, we're a little over, but I could just do a quick demo run through the functionality of the font. If you guys
Yeah?
are into that.
You want to see the final solution, what that should look like, so you have some context?
How am I going to do this? Should I do this? Should I unplug it?
Well, I mean, you could have opened the homework solutions folder and it wouldn't have automatically opened any of the files for them. They would have just seen the file names, which is the exact same thing. So,
But
just in case.
Oh, but you moved the solution folder. You
It's
moved
in
the-
like
It got
either
it's in
homework
5.
3 or
It's in
5.
5, I think.
3 or
Okay.
5.
You did a select and drag, and so you
Oh.
actually moved it.
That was a little detail that I was like,
I think it's in 5.
I'm gonna be on. But
I missed that because
it's
I
okay.
don't use Windows machines.
It's cool. We got it.
What's the like preferred in like the data viz world or like the D3 world? What's like what does everyone make fun of and what do the cool kids use? Between Mac or Windows? Or is it still pretty divided?
I think it's pretty divided still.
I mean, to be fair, like I think Macs are more. I got like this like souped up gaming laptop because I was working. I went to school for medical visualization, so it's like I don't need like this computer. I don't need like the gaming laptop to do what I'm doing now.
I will say that 5, 6, 7, well, I guess it would have been 7 years ago. 7 years ago, if you were a UX designer and you were doing mostly front-end development rather than back-end development, people tended to use Macs. And back-end developers, if you were doing the actual server-side stuff, you tended to be on a PC because you wanted to be on Linux, right? And so you notice this same sort of thing. Most people that are CS people, like in heavy CS people, tend to really like Linux machines and tend to like to be able to soup things up in terms of their graphics cards that Macs don't allow you to do and all of this sort of stuff. So you get that sort of divide. Now, as more and more of kind of data visualization and D3 stuff is very much something that core CS people need to be able to do, and it's not something limited to front-end developers, what you see is among the people using something like D3, a much more even divide, because you've got a lot of people coming from a heavy CS background who are still using that for all of their other back-end stuff, and then a subset of designers who are coming in with the Mac side stuff on top, because it really doesn't matter whether or not they can go in and do all of that heady stuff in updating their file system and whatnot.
And I like the graphic. I studied graphic design before.
And you were using the PC still?
No, we were required in my program to have a backup prep.
Yeah.
It's like a hard.
Yeah. No, so yeah, that is exactly mirroring my expectation and experience then.
So we have a plot. We have a slider. Let's guess what it's doing. Oh, it looks like it's changing on input.
Now, I will note here that that's updating quickly. Part of why you're getting that lag there in the slider, though, is because it's doing the full update up here. If you noticed when we were dragging the slider before and it was just the year, it was always right on top of it. And the reason it's not now, and it's not enough that, like, if you drag just quickly across, right? It's lagging behind and then updating. That's because it's calling each of those functions in update. This is still more than interactive enough where it doesn't matter. Like, in terms of a user interface standpoint, you can tell that you're dragging and it's updating and it's all good. But like if you triple the amount of time that that's taking in the rendering solution, all of a sudden that lag is just going to start to become real noticeable and a pain in the butt, right? And that's when being able to separate out those potential solutions is going to start to become important. But for here and for your purposes, just use on input rather than on changed and get the really cool back and forth visualization of what's going on in your data.
So this is like similar to that TED Talks, right? Of the famous like data visualization guy. Who's
Yeah.
Like, and now
Hans
we're just
Rosling.
going this way,
Yeah.
and now China's going this way.
Is it the exact data set for that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got it
You
from
guys see that?
Gap.
It is. It's exactly.
It's the exact data set.
Like I pulled the data set from Gap.
That was such a cool thing.
Yeah. So you're recreating aspects of that and doing it interactively rather than a video playing behind as you trigger stuff.
With that,
Country selections?
like,
Like, show them the other interaction mechanisms here, Jen.
I you selected, but you were talking. It was like behind.
Oh, okay. I was
So-
talking over it.
If you click on a country, it'll give you stats. This is specific to the year, so if I actually like update this right, it gets a little, there's a lag, but notice that these will update, and it stays, but I keep clicking off of it because the mouse pad is like. But yeah, you can select another country. So this is selected, right? If you select on anywhere else, it'll unselect, or you can select a country and then directly select another country, and it just changes. Or you can select one of these and then drag. You can follow it, see what it's doing through the years. And then, yeah.
So I don't know where Gabon is, but was that so? If you selected.
So
on the,
it was here. It was a small African country right over here.
Okay. So it does highlight it.
Yes, it does highlight it. In that particular case, the one she happened to select was a tiny African country that was difficult to see, given the projector resolution. Cool. Any other questions? Comments?
Is the video going to be updated?
The video here should be already up on. It should be up on the YouTube channel.
Sounds great.